Everyone's caught up through 18. So we're going to go over a few of the questions today, and then moving forward for the next few weeks, we'll be doing 2 chapters a week. And so that should put us about 3 weeks out from the reading stuff, and then we're going to have kind of the wrapping up week will be oriented around a very short kind of discussion, and then the final that you guys will be presented with will be a handwritten essay, much like we already practiced. And so the expectation of the essay, again, is I'm not going to grade it for, grammatical structure and all of that, so it won't be the English essay, because in our limited amount of time, I want the information to be on the page much more than worrying about it. Now, obviously, do your best to formulate it like you would a normal essay. And so we're not going to use computers, we're not typing it out, we're not using spell check, we're going back to the old-fashioned handwritten. And so I will then read those, and then we'll present them back to you with some notes, at which point I'll have you kind of flesh out or answer those questions. And so again, the goal is not to give you a score, a percentage, because quite honestly, I think that does little to help you. But I do think criticism is really important as far as how you're perceiving things and things to think about. So before we jump in today, we are, again, historically in an expansive season that kind of is the spirit of work in Egypt is kind of what we see in the Bible when Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh. And so we've kind of seen the culmination of history, right? Like thousands of years have built up into this moment. I'm going to read real quick from Exodus chapter 5. And it says this: Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working." So this is a pretty significant point in biblical history, but it's a pretty significant shift in Egyptian history too. So why do you think that Pharaoh responded the way that he did? I don't know the Lord. What do you think was going on with Pharaoh there?
To not be afraid.
Yeah, so he was demonstrating his authority. Didn't want to sound fearful, right? Yeah, because if you're Pharaoh and you're like, "Oh, please don't hurt me," all right, you're gonna lose your culture pretty quickly. What are some other thoughts?
He's worshiping all the gods. There's a competition there. So,
yeah. There's a major culture clash.
Yeah, he's God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's get back to the very first thing that we learned was the concept of divine kingship. That Pharaoh believed that he was God on earth. Now, let's examine that a little further. What proof did any of the pharaohs have that was in fact true?
Nada.
Yeah, nothing. Right. There was that, and so this is kind of getting back again. We're going to kind of frame up some of the things that we've discussed. This idea of divine kingship was built off of this counterfeit idea of authority, and they put authority on themselves. And then over the years, what happens? Because at some level, right, you've got you're not performing any miracles, you're not really doing anything of value other than raising a bunch of money for yourself and making a bunch of new names for yourself and decreeing all of these things. But at some point, pharaohs had to buy into this delusion that they were actually gods. They had to truly believe that. Well, think of the years that this has been established as a pattern of life for them, where they believe Pharaoh's truly believed.
That's for Solomon's years.
Yeah, truly believed.
Yeah.
Now it was the wrong belief, but what does that tell us about the power of belief? I mean, people believe things wrongly, and belief, it finds its center or its nutrients. If you were a plant, its source, its power from identity. It's the same thing is true of you guys, right? Who are you to God? What does God call you? Children. But specifically, sons. And it's important, I know the distinction seems weird, right? Children and sons, what's the difference? Well, it's a pretty major difference, because biblically, we've got to understand that the imagery of sonship is used specifically because culturally, right, there is a blessing that is passed through what? Through sons, particularly the firstborn sons. And so when God calls us sons, he does that with intention, right? Jesus is the firstborn among many brothers. And so what the Lord is doing here is would be fully understood to those who were alive back then, because they would understand sonship as being a connection to a blessing, right? And so when we talk about our identity as sons, we want to make sure that we fully encapsulate all of what that means, right? If we truly live in that identity, and this is what we're learning as a people, right? Like, again, we've talked about this last week. There's first generation, my generation. Our generation is first generation to come to a certain way of understanding. You guys are second generation. And so you are blessed because of that understanding. You hopefully will have less struggles with certain things than your parents who went before you. But you'll also have to kind of come to grips with, wrestling with this, the way that your parents had to, that you may not have to wrestle with. And so you don't want to get lost in translation there. You don't want to take for granted those battles that have gone before you. And then for the sake of your kids and their kids, right, there's a lineage, which is really a spiritual lineage that's being passed down. Right? And so we are at this point in history now where Pharaoh and the people of God collide, right? So really it's the world power, Egypt, against this kind of upstart group that are certainly, as we see biblically, they're more in number, but they don't have the world renown of Egypt. When you said Egypt at that time, there was fear that would be brought into the hearts of many around them. We see that because there's been, remember, a military shift with Egypt. Now that isn't true of the Israelites. They certainly would have been known around those parts, but again, they'd been forgotten. It's been a couple hundred years since Joseph came around. Things have been forgotten. The old, and what's important here is it's not so important to note that Pharaoh has forgotten who Joseph's people were. The Israelites have forgotten who they were.
That's important.
And this is significant. They have lost their identity as true sons, right? As the true chosen people. Now this is the culmination of God's work for them, is going to bring a type of Christ, Moses, right? This is a picture of redemption. He's somebody who was born Israelite, who went into Pharaoh's house, was raised in Pharaoh's house, and so he knew all of those ways. But Moses did what? There was a time where he murders the Egyptian and then he flees. In that time, there's kind of this significant thing at play in the natural. Moses is pushing against this spirit of Egypt that has been put on him. For what? For the sake of his people. He has to go out in the wilderness. The Lord has to work in his heart and really kind of establish him again in his true identity, and then he returns. Moses even questions, like, why would you send me? I'm not eloquent enough. And God's, well, I'll give you the words. And so historically, though, we're seeing here at the end of this time that as the military has advanced as being a primary thing, what has happened to Egypt's power has been it's gone from divine kingship, which was central to the first belief, to now we have a fractured government. We have 4 different kind of powers. So we have Pharaoh, right? Then we have the power of the military, and so that's a secondary thing. And then we have kind of now this new kind of pseudo-political class. So these are the viziers, and you could even probably add into there like all of the prophets of all of these different things. And so it's kind of a political / religious ruling class. And then you have the people, right? Because you always have to have a class that can be ruled, right? If you're going to be a leader, you can't say I'm the leader of something and not have any followers, right? You can't be a solitary, like, I lead myself. Well, you follow yourself too, I guess. And so things are beginning to fracture. Why? Because there is now kind of a watering down of this culture and the concepts of this culture. And it says this, so if you got your books, you want to open up to 345. And hopefully I'll address some of these questions in here. To address as well. But it says, 345, unwelcome as it may have been, forced labor was, in theory, part of the contract between the Egyptian people and their rulers. In return for his subjects' daily toll, the king guaranteed the eternal order of the cosmos, appeasing the gods and ensuring Egypt's continued prosperity. And so, obviously we understand that there's forced labor. We certainly understand that from a biblical perspective, that the Israelites were put into forced labor. But this is also talking about the Egyptians themselves. But what is most important here is what was the responsibility of the king who was believed to be divine, God on earth, that it was his job to guarantee eternal order of the cosmos, to appease the gods, and to assure Egypt's continued prosperity. Now things are beginning to fracture, right? And they're fracturing in the natural because we now have pharaohs who've just gone with some of the Ramses who have been really, really powerful rulers. And now we're coming into a time where I think there was 4 generations of rulers within like an 11, 12-year period. So it's turning over. And that was okay in years past because there wasn't a military might that was present. There wasn't kind of the hearts of the people who were now kind of pushing back. And I think one of the questions was here, how did taxation affect the lives of the Egyptians, which is an excellent question. Well, the Egyptians began to get this kind of the same way. Remember, in American history, it was taxes that really caused the Americans to push back against Great Britain, right? No taxation without representation. So the people's power begins to rise. The military power began to rise. The prophets and the religious order, as well as the political order, they all began to rise. Well, what does that do to the power of Pharaoh? It diminishes it, slowly but surely. And so now all of a sudden they had a culture that was each kind of group kind of believed that they had a level of authority. So what does that do though to undermine the king's divine authority? Well, if the king no longer has absolute authority, you cannot say that you have divine kingship. If you are no longer looked to as being a god on earth, the people are pushing back against it, saying, no, we're not going to be taxed. The prophets and the political class are saying, well, no, we're going to control this temple, or we're in charge of this city, right? Thebes was a good example of that. Well, then you have Pharaoh as well, who's saying, well, no, I'm the rightful heir here. But then you have military leaders as well, who have a lot of strength. And again, Pharaoh has gotten away from, it says here, kind of this responsibility of kingship. And this has been building. Again, we talked about it last week. What has been built into the heart of pharaohs is this false belief that they are gods on earth. And although that lasted for thousands of years, at some point it will break down, right? Because what we know in God's ordered universe is that truth will always, always, always come to light. It's inevitable. And so why is it best for us to live in truth today? Because we allow ourselves not to have to go through needless suffering. Why did the Israelites wander? They forgot the truth of who they were. They questioned God, and they looked back to Egypt as if Egypt was the answer. And they wandered, and they wandered, and they wandered. And they were hungry, and they complained about food, and God gave them manna, and that wasn't good enough. They were thirsty, and they needed this, and God gave them all of these things. The Father continued to give them, and yet where was their heart and mindset? It was still back in Egypt. And so again, we have to continue to understand our studies here as studies in the ways of the spirit of the world that is at play. And so whose question was that? How did taxation affect the lives of the Egyptians?
That was mine.
So do you want to elaborate on it? Because it really is, it's a very excellent question. Really well discerned question.
So I think it was after the Battle of Kadesh where they fell into some deep taxation, and there was barely enough. The families could barely feed their families and have enough money to provide for them. And there were also a lot of sickness and diseases going through Egypt. And through the suffering, it began to bring prosperity, but the people that were actually working through it still had very hard lives. And one of the forms of taxation was called, I don't really know how to say it, I think it's like corvée or something, which meant that it was a tax paid through labor, and which was like building temples, and it was actually a punishment for criminals, so it was a pretty bad form of taxation. But once Ramses, I think it was the fourth, when his reign started, he began to take away some of the taxation, and it began to bring some more prosperity and gave the people some hope. But yeah, that's all I wrote about it.
Yeah, very, very well done. Yeah, so thinking in terms of what does taxation communicate to the people? If the Pharaoh is supposed to be the one who brings prosperity and blessing, right, and great wealth, and all of a sudden we've gone from an external pursuit of getting all of this stuff from outside of Egypt and bringing it back to now I'm going to tax you as a people. What does that communicate to you? Well, what are the taxes for?
Pharaoh's weak. He lost his influence.
Yeah. Pharaoh's trying to build wealth. But when you build wealth on the backs of your people, what that communicates, whether they realize it or not, is I need your wealth to make you feel prosperous. Now that doesn't make any sense, right? And for a while that will work. And like you said, some of the pharaohs rightly discerned, like, oh, no, we should probably release these taxes. And this is, sadly, one of the things we're experiencing currently today, is an increase of spending money we don't have. We're just going to give money to this place, to that place, and we're going to, give money away to these people and those people, and we're just making more money. Well, what's the problem with that? Who's going to pay for it? Right.
That's going to pay.
Right. the mindset of, well, I got it for free is a terrible mindset. There's no such thing as a free. There's nothing free. Right? Like when your parents buy you something, it may be free to you, but it came at a cost to them. So there's, and this is important for us to understand, in the same way that people can become very flippant in a religious way about salvation or what Christ has done for us, and can assume in our lives that, we can just be comfortable as Christians because Jesus paid the price. Well, it costs quite a great deal, and there's an expectation with that, right? So if your parents get you something nice, let's pretend your parents buy you a car and give you a car. Is there not expectations with that? What would be some of the expectations? Don't get your hopes up. I'm not buying you a car.
No.
What would be do you think would be some of the expectations your parents may have for that?
Wreck the car.
Yeah, pretty simple one. Don't wreck the car. Oh, yeah, right.
That's a basic.
That's a basic one. What are some other expectations?
You need to find a job, pay your own gas.
Well, there you go. Yeah, have a way to provide for that car and pay for the gas.
Don't speed.
Don't speed. Yeah, I think that's a basic.
Follow the rules.
Yeah, right. Follow the laws. That you're going to observe the laws.
Give me a ride.
Yeah, that's right. It's my turn to sit and be on my phone
Yeah.
while you're driving for hours on end.
That's right.
Maybe take that money that they could have spent on the car and invest it into something else in the future. or
Right.
something.
And so maybe I'm blessing you to free you of the burden of paying so that you might set that aside versus spend it frivolously on other things, right? And you do have some people that have that mindset, well, my parents paid for a car I was saving for, so I'm going to go and spend it on silly things. Right? And so again, what we're talking about here now in the downward spiral, as it says here, is about expectations. And again, I really want us to make this connection between expectations and identity, because there's an important distinction or an important kind of translation on how one affects the other. Your identity, who you truly believe you are. So there's two identities at play, really. There's a reality of who you are, and that's kind of God's economy, God's mindset, how he sees things. And then there's this false identity that is much like the spirit of Egypt that has been built.
Endowed identity and self-assumed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The others' expectations,
Mm-hmm.
expectation given, expectation self design.
Right.
Self-assumed.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's perfect.
Yeah.
And so if we're not careful and we take on this label of who we're not intended to be, we believe falsely about ourselves, or we lower the standards even, right? Like we don't hold ourselves to the standard. We will, the fruit of that tree, the outcomes there will be in keeping with how we see ourselves or perceive ourselves. And so this is what's kind of taking place within a culture. When that happens, a culture will break down. Well, let's take a look at modern American culture. We are going through some really significant breakdowns culturally that are not too far off from what we see currently as we're reading through Egyptian history. We see the power of a central figure, right? The presidency, that is supposed to represent a certain thing, but it's not. It's really been minimized in a lot of ways. Well, then we have this kind of ruling class. Well, they're not really engaged the way they should. Well, then we used to be known as a Christian nation. But what is the problem? The church has long since failed its people, and it has become something that it never was intended to become. Insulated, isolated, arrogant. And then you have the people.
You also have military.
Yeah.
Compound, whatever.
Yeah, the military, yes. Yeah, it's a huge... In fact, the quickest way to expand the finances of a nation, get yourself involved in a war. War has a way of increasing production and all of those things around it. And so there's this downward spiral that we are kind of at. Let's move on to page 347 here. And it's about halfway down. It says that soaring grain prices reflected the weakness of the economy and the failure of the government to guarantee wages. Contemporary accounts hint at hunger, even starvation, as the peasantry bore the full brunt of the hard times. Now, again, what happens when we break down from a government standpoint and increase taxes? Well, that causes a great difficulty for the people, right? I mean, if the people can't have to pay their taxes as primary, what becomes secondary is providing for themselves. This is what we see is called, in the modern terms, inflation. So prices are inflated. So when we look around right now, you may not feel the pinch of this. Well, some of you might, because you started driving. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel the pinch.
Yeah, you feel the pinch of it. Well, think about just the gas prices alone. Noe, how long have you been driving for now?
Good 3 years.
Good 3 years. So would you say in the last 3 years prices have increased significantly, moderately, or barely at all?
3 years. I don't know if I can tell the difference between moderately or significantly, but I would say probably significantly.
Probably significant. Well, to give you a concept of when I was a kid, which, listen, I'm old but not super old, right? And so probably when I was like 13 or 14 years old, gas was still under $1 a gallon.
Seriously? Oh my God.
10 years ago, gas was still roughly right around $2 a gallon. So within a 10-year span, we've gone up to over $5 a gallon. In some places in California, it was up to $9 a gallon.
Killing me.
Now, all of this goes into, and maybe we'll branch on this in some future study where we can talk about economics a little bit as far as history is concerned. And so it's all supply and demand. But what controls that should be the central figure who is meant to be an authority. Right? And if the idea is that I'm a divine king and have authority and power to bring upon wealth, and I'm failing to do that, and not only am I failing to provide for you some level of prosperity, but I'm extorting, taking money from you to have this image, then the power of the Pharaoh is decreasing. The authority and power, though, of the people is increasing. Now, we see this reflected in Moses. There was something that God was doing in Moses' heart to lead a people, because the Israelites didn't know this, but they were yearning and hungering for a Savior, somebody who would take them out of their misery. Now, they did not possibly conceive in their minds who that could have been, when that could have been, and they had settled for, I guess I'll just be as good a slave as I can be, and I'll die. See, they bought into the lie of who they were. They were not merely, brick builders. God had a plan and a purpose and a destiny for them. And so we see that as grain prices begin to increase, there's a lot of difficulty and challenge. And then let's go fast forward here to 348. And it says this at the very bottom of the page: cruel fate dealt pharaonic prestige the final blow. In happier times, a rapid succession of monarchs could have been managed. Now, a series of short reigns seemed to undermine the ineffectiveness of Egypt's rulers. Divine kingship looked like an increasingly academic concept. All right, so all of a sudden it has gone from a very real experience to something we can only academically think about.
Wow.
There's a shift here. Right now, don't miss this. Please don't miss this. It doesn't matter what you think. You need to live out of a reality of who you are. See, this is the mistake most people make. And how do you shift that? Because some of us think wrongly, and it's okay to think wrongly. It's okay to be uninformed. There's a Greek word for it. It's agnoeo, which is where we get the term agnostic from. So somebody who is agnostic thinks there might be a God, but they're not really convinced. That word actually means ignorant. So we throw around the word ignorant as if it's like, it's a dig at someone. To be ignorant of something is not wrong. There's plenty of things I'm ignorant about. I try to learn how to change anything on a car, like fix a car in any way. I'm totally ignorant of that. It's important for me to understand that and not have pride and go, well, I can fix it. Well, no, Justin is ignorant. And so what does ignorant Justin do? I find people who are skilled And either I take it to them or I ask people who are skilled. How do you do that? I'll give you one really good example of that. We had our headlights go out. Now, changing headlights, pretty simple. No clue. I could have noodled it out. I asked Tim. Tim knows a lot more about that stuff than me. So we got the headlights, and he goes, I can show you. And he pointed in the car where there's 2 pins that you go, bloop, and you pull the thing out and pop it out, and then you pop a thing in. Like it was as easy as changing a light bulb. But I was ignorant. Now, I could have been prideful, tried to figure it out on my own. I could have been embarrassed or shamed. But my ignorance of that subject is not defined by who I was. It didn't make me lesser than. And so because I can be confident that God has given me skills that I'm really good at, it doesn't bother me to have to be humble to go to somebody else, even though it feels silly. But see, again, the Egyptian culture here, represented in Pharaoh, is Pharaoh has to keep control and power in this image out there. But the reality is that Egypt was crumbling down around this whole idea of divine kingship. And instead of addressing the underlying problems there, Pharaoh continued to persist in this mentality that they were divinely kings. Because for thousands of years, that's what their identity had been built up in. See, Egypt gives us this true understanding of what does it look like when our identity is built upon the wrong things. Your identity, if it's not built in something that is true, will crumble. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing that Egypt fell. We know that because if you have any rudimentary understanding of the Bible, it had to fall so that God's people could be truly represented. And what God was showing, I believe, in a large part was that this power of the world is insignificant compared to God's power. In fact, when you understand or you study all of the different plagues that God visits upon Pharaoh, you actually can see that there's a lot of historians that have made connections to each of those plagues represents kind of a challenge to some of their most significant gods, like the god of the frogs. And God said, okay, well, I'm going to show you the god of the frogs, and he makes the frogs just cover the land. And so we see here this vacuum, right? Divine kingship looked like an increasing academic concept. The all too obvious mortality of Ramses the 6th, 7th, and 8th, all 3 dying within an 11-year period, merely emphasized their lack of credit with the gods. Politics abhors a vacuum. And as the influence of the royal court declined, so the stock of the great families of provincial Egypt rose. At Thebes in particular, the most important offices were increasingly concentrated in the hands of a smaller number of aristocratic dynasties. And so we've went from a national concept to now cities are being controlled, insulated by their own authorities. And so this is going back from this would be the equivalent, the modern equivalent of we gather as a people, but now all of a sudden we're upset. And so we're not going to do that anymore. We're all going to be individuals, families. And we might meet, we might talk together, but, I'm going to do things this way. And this family's going to do things that way. And that family's going to do things this way. Well, how long do you think that takes before things erode? Not very long at all.
One generation.
Yeah. It is much, and this goes back to the point, it is much easier to destroy a culture, much, much easier to destroy a culture than it is to establish and continue a culture. You see, continued culture building takes vigilance and persistence and reflection. Discipline, yeah, absolutely. At Thebes in particular, the most important offices were increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small number of aristocratic dynasties. Offices passed from father to son in accordance with the Egyptian ideal, but ignoring the super ideal of the royal prerogative. The king exercised less and less real influences as state offices became quasi-hereditary. Taxation increases, the power of different individuals throughout increases, the power of the people increases, the national identity decreases, the cultural commitment to a standard of life decreases and weakens, and things crumble. It takes one It takes one bad choice to destroy the things that you have built up. It takes one poor decision. Now let's translate this to your character.
Oh.
Character is something that should be built and maintained, not for the sake of what other people think about you, but for the integrity of who you are. Right? If my integrity and my character are formed out of a conviction of who I truly am, then I will live in a certain way regardless of what people think of me. Is that correct? But if I make one bad decision, that can certainly negatively impact people's view. Does it not? I mean, have any of you ever experienced like things were going good and then you made one bad decision, your parents lost trust or your friends lost trust? Was it difficult to repair that?
Word.
Yeah, it takes work, right, to restore ourselves back to a position of, well, why is it, again, why is this significant? And what does this have to do with Egypt at all? Because who we are as a people matter. When we study history, who they are as a culture, as a people, their understandings matter, because it is their beliefs that will span the test of time. This whole experiment with the way that Americans operate is a test. Even the framers in the Constitution, they call it the Great Experiment.
Experiment. They call it experiment.
Yeah, this is a great experiment to see. And what they believed is that freedom would be something that the American people would always have if they fought for it, if they continued to practice and discipline a certain particular way of life. Now, we've gotten vastly and far away from that. The question is, will we go the way of Egypt and the Babylonians and Greece and Rome, or will we be established? Well, the better question is not who we will be as Americans, but who will we be as God's people? Who will we be as truly people who are building up the house of God? Will we allow the same mindsets that have, we see, deteriorated here, the culture of Egypt? And before we think too highly of ourselves, because that's the tendency sometimes to say, well, I'm not like they were. Well, let's take a look at the Israelites. Because you are them. Often. And I will say this. I can promise you this. Real quick, just a show of hands, just to see. How many of you have ever sinned? How many of you say you sinned within the last week? The last day? The last hour? Well, we all have. I can promise you this. One thing that I can guarantee. I don't know a lot, and there's things I'm probably wrong on. This is one of those things I can say unequivocally, without a doubt. Every time you have sinned, it is because you've taken your eyes off of God and you've taken your eyes off of who you are as His Son. 100% of the time. You will not sin if your heart and mind and eyes are fixed on Jesus and who you are to God. You just can't.
Amen.
You cannot walk in sonship knowingly, visibly looking at God and go the other direction. You just can't. So what that tells us is, first of all, that you're human and that you will fail. But how do you manage that? So this is really critical. Pharaohs here could have really had some self-reflection here and addressed the things that were ailing their culture. They were too fixed to this false concept of divine kingship. So the very thing that made them great as a people is their downfall. The very things that make you skilled, gifted, fantastic can be your greatest weaknesses. So how do we walk that out as a people? Well, again, it comes back down to who you are in your identity. Wise people, when they make mistakes, reflect upon who they are. And if it's incongruent, meaning you're doing something that doesn't fit with who you are, then you change your behavior. Not as some mere exercise in trying to noodle it out and work it out yourself, but by demonstrating true humility and getting back to a place of firm ground. So when you sin, you can beat yourself up, call yourself a bunch of horrible names, or you can stop and recognize that it's wrong and return to who you are. See, David did this really well when David, they used to tear their clothing and put on ashes. It was kind of a symbolic thing to say, like, I'm repenting, I'm tearing away from this old pattern of life and being reestablished. But David would go back to God and say, wash my hands, cleanse me, search me, know me. See, he's going back to the place where he found his true identity. This is why I believe David is called a man after God's own heart, because David was a failure in so many ways. But the big times of life when David made a mistake, he returned to his father. That speaks to our identity. And so, and we'll close here. And so I want us to consider this study in Egyptian history as really kind of a pattern, again, in our lives. So what does Egypt speak about? Well, it speaks about the ways of the world, the purposes of the world throughout all of time. And the foolish mistakes that we will make, like the Israelites, are that we won't be influenced by it. But as we see in the Bible, Israelites came into Egypt and they were successful people because of Joseph. And they lived really well. But then they forgot who they were, they forgot their identity in God, and they became comfortable in Egypt. I don't believe God's heart really was for them to stay in Egypt. I think God used Egypt in the famine so that they could be saved, but it was never God's intention to let them live in Egypt. And so when God said go, when God says go, we should go. But what was the problem with the Israelites? They went physically, they went out, but they didn't go with the intention or the mindset or the heart of identity as God's son, right? Yeah. And we only see that, right, really reflected in Caleb and Joshua, who really have this mindset of sonship. And so when they go into the promised land with all the giants, they're like, those like ants to God. These things are weak to God. But everyone else is fear and trembling. So what do we discern from this? Egypt is a really great power. But the God of this universe used the culture, Egypt's own culture, this idea of divine kingship, God used against the false gods of Egypt to destroy them. We see that clearly when the plagues very clearly visit them. And so God destroys Egypt. Now, how do we take that again into personal application and understanding? Well, you're all right. You will wrestle with this. What is the world and what is of God? Am I going to choose this pattern of thinking or pattern of life or this? And make no mistake, I will say this in full disclosure and full honesty. The ways of the world are not simply always just the ugly things we think about. Like, that's very worldly. Well, if you can identify it as being that's very worldly, then that's probably not the struggle you have. It is the subtle counterfeits of Egypt. Solomon says it this way: it is the little foxes that spoil the vines. And so why, as a people, do we get back to this concept of identity? Because in your identity as sons, there's safety. See, my identity as God's son means that I don't have to rush to decisions on certain things, but that I can always be measured. My identity as a son keeps me rooted in the fact that there's plenty of things that I am ignorant of and am in need of others to submit to. This is the beauty of having a leadership structure God the Father, the leadership over a people, the heads of household, their wives, their children submitted under those authorities. Because the submission there is to what? It's to, by the way, it's the same concept as Egypt had, divine kingship. But divine kingship wasn't simply placed on a succession of people. It was represented truly and faithfully in Christ. And Christ, when Jesus was on the earth, said, you want to see the Father, you look at me. So Jesus was meant to represent, right, the Father's heart for his people. So true divine kingship goes back to God the Father in a healthy structure. And so, I will leave it here. I would encourage you all, to consider your ways. The things you think, how you interact, the choices that you make, and if it's helpful, through this lens. Is this from the spirit of the world or the Spirit of God? Which of these is moving me towards it? And again, don't assume that the spirit of the world is this really horrible, ugly decision. It's not as simple as, well, should I murder my parents or let them live? What should I do? I don't know. It's a lot more subtle. Well, think about this. What did Jesus say? If you say you fool in your heart, you've committed murder.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So when your parents say something you don't like, maybe you don't talk back to your parents. Maybe you don't, right? Because none of you would do that. But if in your heart you're like, you fool, there is a spirit at work here.
Yeah.
I know we chuckle because we're probably like, dang it, how did he know? Because we all do that. Because admit it, you have unhealthy thoughts at times.
Yep.
Well, this is why we take things captive and we bring it back into submission. See, the spirit of Egypt is at work.
Sorry.
The spirit of this world, the spirit of this age. And it's subtle, because the Bible tells us really clearly that Satan disguises himself as what? An angel of light. And light is good. The devil is decidedly not.
Yeah. It's very bad.
And so I would continue to encourage you, as I will encourage myself and Brother Emmanuel. I know we need this admonishment as well, to encourage all of us to have a mindset
The more we know, the less we know.
Yeah, right, that really discerns, that seeks to discern truly what the Father is saying.
Yeah.
Not in some things, not on only the big decisions of life, but to consider actually the way that we live. And the best way I can encourage you to do that is through your identity.
Amen.
And so maybe the problems that some of us are having are not as much about coming to a conclusion or an answer out here as it is going back to firmly remembering who we are as God's sons.
Yes. Amen.
And maybe once we're reminded of that, then we're a little bit more equipped to deal with the challenges of life.
Yes.
And so we will leave it at that. Thank you all for your time, as always. So this coming week, we will be reading 2 more chapters, and we'll send out an email text. And I will try to get to answering those questions. I know
Which chapter?
Chapter 19 and 20, House Divided, Tarnished Throne. We'll focus on that